Welcome to Purdue Crop Chat, a regular podcast from Hoosier Ag Today and the Purdue University Extension Service, featuring Purdue Extension soybean specialist Dr. Shaun Casteel and Extension corn specialist Dr. Dan Quinn. Joining Shaun and Dan on this edition of the podcast are Purdue Extension ag economists Jim Mintert and Michael Langemeier. It's the August USDA Crop Report, and all four will analyze the report and update you on conditions across Indiana in corn and soybean fields. This podcast is made possible by the Indiana Corn Marketing Council and Indiana Soybean Alliance. Your Indiana corn and soybean checkoff investments yesterday are paying off today. New research, new uses, demand creation, bringing dollars back to the farm. Check it out at yourcheckoff.org. Now, from right near the Agronomy Center for Research and Education and the Indiana Corn and Soybean Innovation Center in West Lafayette, Indiana, your host, Hoosier Ag Today's Eric Pfeiffer.
And we are live. Shaun, no more cursing. I can't edit this out, okay? We're live, we're on air, we're going. It's now. Eric Pfeiffer here from Hoosier Ag Today. Thanks for joining us. We're live if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube via Hoosier Ag Today online. We're still recorded and doing it the same way we normally are if you're listening to the Purdue Crop Chat podcast via the normal channels at HoosierAgToday.com and other places. But we wanted to come to you live today. It's a big USDA report day. We're talking about crop production. We're talking about some other numbers, and we needed a big crowd to do that today, and we apparently couldn't find anywhere air conditioned, so we wanted to sit out here by the corn and the soybeans out here in the sun, roasting, toasting. But hey, I'm all right with it. I mean, you guys could have brought some more drinks, Shaun.
Well, at least I brought some drinks.
Okay.
It was Andy's idea to be outside, and who's under the tent?
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah. Andy Eubank behind the camera today. Feeling pretty good back there behind the tent, I suppose. But you see, I've got a lot of folks here, and we've got a lot of opinions and a lot of things going on. Dan Quinn is here to my left immediately. Hello, Dan.
Hey, Eric.
Soybean Shaun Casteel, as usual, right over there.
Howdy, Eric.
He's the tall one, but we can't really tell that while sitting down, so that's good.
Was that purposeful?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Michael Langemeier looking pretty good after we've got some of these recent rains.
Yeah, I think overall conditions are very good. You just look at the USDA crop condition ratings, and over the last I'd say 4 or 5 weeks they've improved week over week. So sitting at 64% good to excellent, which is really good to see. Talking to a lot of farmers around the state and just driving around the state. I mean, the turnaround we've had this year from where we were in June until now, just with the recent rainfall, and I think that really has been reflected in the crop production estimates at 195 bushels per acre, right? So that's just an excellent yield estimate, as those condition ratings can
To how much rain we've been getting in the month of July and coming to August, and that's multiplied in multiple ways. And what's occurring with that is in the month of June, we were dry, not much above ground growth, which is great, rooted real deep, but then our nodules that develop off root hairs were limited. And so once the water came back, roots were starting to grow, and that's a good thing. But then you get too much water in that soil profile, and you're actually going to inundate it in such a point that you don't have enough oxygen. And so in that case, root hairs are starting to die a little bit. Nodulation is going to kind of be hit on the chin a little bit there. So I think we have some nitrogen issues on some of these fields that aren't as well drained, that have been getting more rains. You look at the month of June, we had areas that got 1 or 2 inches, if that, and now we've got areas that got upwards of 10 inches in the month of June. So I think some of those are starting to pan out in a negative way, but we'll see if we dry out, we might be able to pull through that.
Yeah, we mentioned on the last episode of the Purdue Crop Chat that soybeans were looking really, really good just a couple of weeks ago. I think they still are for the most part.
I think so.
But your estimate was what, 60, right?
I believe it was dead on 60 is
yeah.
what I did.
And
today's forecast was what?
It was 60, but
60
take a chance, man.
Okay.
Take a chance. Let's
What was your
obliterate.
estimate?
I don't remember.
Okay.
It wasn't an educated guess. It was just a guess.
True.
That's
I don't know what was Dan's. Was his an educated guess?
Oh, well, as educated as he can be.
Is 195 is that record for corn, or is it close?
It's tied for state record.
Tied. Okay.
2021.
Okay.
So it's also 195.
As is 60 for soybeans,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yes.
So no one wants to go out on a limb here and say we're actually going to break something. We've just got to keep tying it.
Above yield trend. I mean, soybeans, that's 9.5% above yield trend. So I mean, that's saying something for the month of June that we had. And again, it's the type of month that we all like because they root down deep as long as they got established, and they did, and get the rain that comes back. We got beans, like you said, they look wonderful.
Market reaction was interesting because it was positive initially and then backed away as the day progressed. And I think really, to some extent, it'll be interesting to hear what Dan and Shaun have to say about this. I think part of that might have been a realization, or at least an expectation, that since the surveys were conducted, that yield conditions have maybe actually improved in the U.S. I think people are probably wondering about the yield estimates that USDA published because they came in for the national average. You guys keep talking about Indiana, but of course what really matters from a market standpoint is the national numbers. They came in at 175 on corn, and I think people are wondering if maybe the final number could actually be larger than that, given conditions that here the last roughly 10 days or so. If you look at it from a broader perspective, not just the USDA is suggesting, because this yield survey, in the sense that we're sending people out into the field, formed those last couple of days of July, the first couple of days of August. So, and I guess my question to you guys is, relative to where you were the last couple of days of July, the first couple of days of August, have you changed your yield expectations over these last 10 or 12 days?
Well, as we're kicking each other back and forth on our yield estimates, it was about that time that we kind of said, Eric keeps on trying to pin us on the yield number, and I said, shoot, I'll do it. I said 60, and it was right at that time. And if you think about the month of July, I mean, again, about every Saturday, it seemed like we were getting an inch and a half rain, and so it was definitely setting up the stage for really good yield potential on the soybean side. If we hadn't, I mean, we had plenty of talks in the month of June. People, part of July, that's when we were going to get concerned. And I mean, both crops, I mean, you in particular, because you're a little bit of a diva with your corn during pollination, you got the rain, right? So would you say that you're still pretty positive on the crop?
Oh yeah, very positive. And I think, it's really reflected in the crop condition ratings is that they've been increasing week after week, and that's something we've seen across the state. And you talk to farmers and different folks around the state, it's like our crop is just getting better, right? And it's to the point now where we caught those rains at that pollination period, which is so critical for corn, and now we're into that grain fill stage. And the thing with
at the national level, here's your chance. Go ahead and bash them if you need to. They're not watching, maybe. But do you believe what they put out there, or do you think that maybe is still a little out of reach, or maybe even better potential?
When I saw 195, I thought that was a little on the high side, but close. Just because the state state record was 195, 2021. Crop condition ratings were pretty much 70 to 74% good to excellent throughout the entire. At Darcy Talenko's map. 24 counties is where it was at. I think the good thing is that just looking at the recent report, I think the state is moving about half into the dough stage for corn. So that's kind of that stage where she, I think in our last podcast she kind of talked about once you get into maybe the dough or even the dent stage, we don't see as much of a benefit from fungicide, as much of an impact. So the good thing is that a lot of we're still finding tar spot. I think in a lot of the areas it's still at relatively low levels, and that crop is progressing to the point where it's not going to be as big of an impact. But it's still something to monitor, right? It's just something. You look at the rainfall we've had, the high humidity that we've had.
These dewy mornings, like every morning they're covered with.
That really gets me concerned when you talk about tar spot, and it seems like every time I talk to Darcy and a lot of my students are rating their trials for disease, it seems like every week or every couple of days that they do that, they're finding more and more. So that's been the biggest concern, but I think the message has been clear. Farmers, now it's not 3-4 years ago, they're on top of it, they're watching it very closely. A lot of them make pretty informed fungicide decisions, so a lot of fungicide has been sprayed. I think that's going to help a lot of farmers in those especially more severe areas. So I think a lot of folks have been on top of it and been watching it very closely, and we're getting to the point where that crop is progressing along enough where hopefully it doesn't impact it as bad if it gets worse and worse as we move forward.
My takeaway is the only solution might be to stop talking to Darcy. She might stop finding things. Again, Eric Pfeiffer here from Hoosier Ag Today, Dan Quinn, Shaun Casteel, Michael Langemeier, who we haven't let talk yet. We'll change that in just a moment. But Jim Mintert over there. Jim, I do want to follow up and ask, you were talking about just this Ukraine and Russia situation. One, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen going forward. The expiration of the grain deal, they've been going back and forth at each other. Ukraine hitting some Russian ports and back and forth. So we don't know what's actually going to happen there. But just looking back, we didn't know what was going to happen then either. How did they get so much grain out of there? I mean, it's perplexing to me. I can't figure it out. That's all we've been talking about is how it wouldn't happen, and then you're telling me it happened.
Export deals with Russia did matter. I think there was some skepticism early as to whether or not they would, whether or not that'd be enough to make people feel safe enough to actually move grain that way. It turned out they did. So it was a multitude of things, but there's still a wild card going forward. And I think one of the things that's taking place in the market right now is the fact that you see the announcements, the grain deal's on, the grain deal's off. The market's tired of that, right? It's more of a recognition of we don't really care. Somehow they're managing to get supplies out of that country, and that's more of a proof the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, in the standpoint of, well, we'll believe that they can't get it out when we have evidence that it's not getting out. So I think that's where we're at right now, but I think that the bigger issue is on a worldwide basis.
And we talk a lot about break-evens as well. Where do you see those right now, Mike?
We've actually had some good news with respect to break-evens looking ahead. In 23, it's a classic scenario where you have relatively high input costs, and then the fall hits or the marketing year hits, and prices decline. You're looking at some pretty ugly margins, and so it's no surprising. It's not that surprising that margins are down substantially in 23. The good news from break-evens for 24 is we've seen some drops in fertilizer prices, particularly nitrogen, and if that holds, you're looking at some a reduction in break-even prices for corn of 40 to 50 cents, which is rather substantial. We're still probably not where we need to be long term, but I'm pretty confident we'll be able to bring that break-even down to $5 for corn and $12 for soybeans, which just happens to match the long-run price projections coming from Missouri and USDA ERS, and so that's a mixed story. Yes, the margins in 24 are not going to be as good as what they were in 2021 and 22, but actually I think just looking right now, I mean, this is pretty risky to put your neck on the line for 24 margins. I think right now they're going to be a little better than 23.
Yeah, I actually have some talking to some farmers, and they've been locking in their nitrogen prices for next year, and they're actually back down to like 2019 prices for their nitrogen fertilizer. So they've been pretty happy about that.
But nearly 50 cents to the pound.
Yeah, right around. Farmer I talked to is right around 49-50 cents per pound.
That's pretty good
for nitrogen fertilizer.
Listening to you guys talk, unlikely that that's going to go south on us. Probably the bigger question is what happens in some of the upper Midwest states. So if you look at some of the states that were below a year ago, and I guess Illinois is kind of central corn belt, but Illinois, Minnesota are probably two of the bigger question marks on the corn side, and pretty much the same story with respect to soybeans. So I think that's probably going to be more of the focus than what takes place so much here in Indiana.
Yeah, I think the crop ratings that we were talking about through the month of June and into July, I'd bring up Illinois, and they were up planted earlier than we were, good crop established, but they just weren't getting the rains, and so I think that's been part of that story. I was looking at the drought map earlier today, and Illinois, you go into Iowa, you go into Minnesota, so what you're describing on the forecast for
the soybean to corn ratio is really high right now.
Yeah.
That's going to have an impact on 24 acreage decisions, and so that's going to be really interesting to watch on how producers in the U.S. respond to that higher corn acreage this year.
To that point, Michael, we have this conversation, I think, just about every year, but I'd like your take on it. Here in Indiana, it seems like a lot of guys, they're just on a 50-50 rotation, and they're going to go with what's next. But it's really throughout the rest of the Corn Belt here where people are really making that decision. Do we see that changing at any point? With you're talking about soybeans being substantially more profitable?
It happened this year.
Yeah,
we saw more continuous corn in the Dakotas, but in particular in Iowa and Illinois. And typically what you watch for corn, if corn looks really competitive, you look for a continuous corn to increase in Iowa. and to some extent in Illinois. That's what you watch, and that's exactly what we found when they increased the corn acreage to 94 million. A chunk of that was in Iowa and Illinois. You might think, well, Nebraska's in play there. No, it's not, because Nebraska has so much irrigation, and it's typically 2-to-1 corn to soybeans anyway. And so Nebraska really doesn't change that much. It's Iowa and Illinois, and to some extent the Dakotas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, soybeans were king of the hill in Indiana for a while, close to 5.9, 6 million, maybe not quite 6 million acres for a couple of years. And I think a lot of it, we were talking about fertilizer prices. And I remember bringing you on, Michael, Crop Chat during that time, and said, the prices are high on fertilizer, but you pencil out the numbers that still go with corn. But I don't know how much they listen to you or not, because we did have more acres on the soybean. But I do appreciate that, and I give Dan a hard time, obviously, on soybean being the most profitable, the money maker and everything else. But, I think that's a big part of it. You've got
the soybeans and then a 50-50 rotation in Indiana compared to Illinois, and in particular compared to Iowa.
I'll let you hand that mic over to Jim and let him add on. I will point out while we're doing that, if you do have questions and you're watching the live stream on Facebook, be sure to pop in a question. We'd be happy to take that. But Jim, go ahead. Your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the considerations going forward, not so much in 2024, but looking ahead several years, is what's going to take place with respect to soybean processing capacity, particularly in the upper Midwest, and whether or not that has an impact on soybean acreage. I think it will. I think it'll have an impact on aggregate soybean acreage across the U.S., but I think in particular it's going to have an impact in the upper Midwest. So it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. Just a lot of moving parts to this whole renewable diesel situation, but longer run, that looks positive for soybeans. And Indiana is probably not going to be one of the key states there in terms of obtaining some new processing capacity. It's probably going to be elsewhere around the country, so that could have an impact as well going forward. And Shaun, I got a comment on the idea about planting soybeans and corn at the same time. I remember a few years ago at the Top Farmer Conference, you and Bob Nielsen were on the program, and you were advocating planting soybeans earlier. Yep. And one of the farmers in attendance that day asked, should I start planting soybeans before I plant corn? And you and Bob had to kind of scratch your heads a little bit, on, particularly Bob, on that one. It's whether or not that was a good idea. But lo and behold, we have seen that take place. I've seen situations where people were planting beans and a corn planter was sitting in the yard, right? So that's a big change.
It is. It's a huge change. And again, just 2014 to 17 period, again, 10 to 14 days. And then we go 2018 to 21, 22, take 19 out of the late planted year. We're within 4 days, and now we're planting them at the same time at the state level. And again, certainly we've got those farmers that are also, I'm planting the beans, I'm not even going to touch the corn. It needs to have a little bit better conditions, and the beans have done quite well with it.
I was going to say, Shaun, how long has that been the conversation? Now, you've been talking about planting them timely, but a lot of people planting them early. Yep. How long has that been the conversation now?
I've been really pushing that since about 2016 and 17. And, timely, I've always used that term, but for some people that means early. Because April 25th and May 1st, that's corn, right? That's too early for beans, and we'll get beans in whenever the corn's done. And I think that mentality has definitely changed. I'm not saying we have to go into the March or April Fool's Day kind of thing, but certainly the last weeks of April have been on my docket for a good number of years.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, just talking to the farmers too, they've made that kind of mental change with soybeans, but it's also they've kind of learned with corn, there's a little bit of flexibility, and when you want to plant that crop, it's not as adaptable as something like a soybean. It needs to have rapid emergence, it needs to have uniform emergence, it needs to be planted in really good conditions, and what we're starting to find is if you have a little bit higher soil temperatures for corn, maybe if you wait until mid-May or so, you can still get it on the ground a lot quicker. It can get out of the ground more uniform and get off to a better start. Where soybeans, I think there's a little more of a physiological aspect to it. It can adapt a lot better. It just kind of can handle maybe a little bit of the earlier planting.
Well, I think it's handling, but then also
folks, and as they're doing something right from a financial standpoint, right? They've figured out some innovative ways to really get in there and become profitable. Talk a little bit about the farm management tour.
Yeah, so the farm management tour this summer, of course, was down in Washington and Jackson counties with the Rowland Farm in Washington County and the Hackman Farm in Family Farm Market in Jackson County. And you're right, Eric, we focus on people who have been successful, but we focus on people that are doing innovative things, right? And both of those farms are extremely innovative. For the Hackmans, it was about enterprise diversification, in particular moving into produce operation, especially watermelons, but also some other produce, for example, fresh tomatoes. That created the opportunity to bring home 3 young people into an existing farm operation, and that is so difficult to do these days, right? For most farms, it's a struggle to bring home one of their offspring into the farm. They managed to bring back 3, so it was phenomenal. And on the Rollins, a similar situation with respect to bringing back a family member, but there was also diversification of enterprises, and they focused on constructing a layer house, a 100,000 hen layer house, producing eggs that was targeted towards the California market and earning a premium for doing that. So those enterprises were very interesting. And then I'll let Michael talk a little bit because he focused more heavily on this, I think, a little bit. But on the Roland farm, they were a very innovative user of cover crops and an early adopter. And I think one of the messages was just because you adopt doesn't mean you don't change, right? Because they were evolving over time with respect to some of their management practices.
I think that was true to some extent on both farms. If you're going to try something different, you're probably going to run into some snags once in a while, and the important thing is sticking with it. You know, tweaking the system and getting better at it. And both of the farms, you could say that they're doing that in spades. If something doesn't work, they tweak it next year and see if it's going to work. But I want to piggyback on what Jim was talking about. Both of these farms brought people back through diversification. And many times in production agriculture, we think low cost, low cost, low cost. And I've been guilty of that myself. But you also have to think about adding value. Is there something I can do with the acreage base that I have that would perhaps add value to this farm so I can bring somebody back to the operation? So think about both of those when you're thinking about bringing somebody back. And the reason why I say that's so important is Jim and I know this, and we all know this, that there's areas of Indiana and across the Corn Belt where it's so competitive, the cash rent market, that you got to think outside the box a little bit, and you're not necessarily going to be able to add rented acres, or maybe there's not some ground close to you that you can buy, even if you have the wherewithal to do so. And so you have to think outside the box a little bit and see, is there something we can do besides just adding acres?
Michael, I'm going to ask you this, and again, we're live, so I can't edit this out if your answer is no. I'm not ready to answer that. But earlier this week, USDA released a report about farmland values, and you're talking about cash rents, you're talking about other things. Can you speak to some of that report and what things are looking like here in Indiana?
I'm going to talk more about the Purdue Ag Econ report that Todd Keithy puts together every August, and Jim, Todd, and I did a podcast recently, related to this topic, and the cash rent picture is probably quite a bit different this year than it has been the last few years, and it goes back to the net returns we're expecting in 23. Typically, when you see a drop in net returns, that tends to hold cash rent where it's at, or maybe a slight decline in cash rent. When I say slight, I mean slight. We're not looking at a large drop in cash rent. On the land value side, I think what it meant is rather than double-digit increases like we saw in 21 and 22, we're looking at increases that are closer to zero. Maybe slight increase, but closer to zero. And so that part of that's due to the changing a net return picture, but a big chunk of the land value is due to higher interest rates. We saw some rather substantial increase in interest rates here in the last 12 to 18 months. That's also putting some downward pressure on land values and preventing them from continuing to take off at double-digit percentages.
Interest rates went up? I had no idea. You mentioned, Michael, that you just did a podcast recently. Dan, Shaun, here's your chance. We've got them because they may not come back. They're going to be doing their own podcast and trying to blow us out of the water here. What do we have any other questions for Michael and Jim?
Oh, man, put us on the spot.
Well, yeah, that's what I do. That's why I'm here.
No, I just appreciate the perspective that you guys bring. Even talking about yields and the ratios of corn to soybeans, some things that just crossed my mind as you talk about the Iowa, the Illinois, and we've always kind of known that they tend to have a little more continuous corn. So I guess more than anything, it's not a question, but an appreciation for what you guys have brought to the table today and definitely enlightened us and others.
Yeah, same for me. I'd appreciate a little more positive corn talk, than.
He doesn't speak with forked tongue now, so I mean he speaks the truth, and we'll always invite him back whenever soybeans came.
From my perspective, it's really fascinating to think about how the technology has changed and how we think about planting corn versus soybeans has changed dramatically. From example, for when I was helping my dad, right?
Yeah.
We were pretty much like everybody else, plant corn first. not worried too much about exactly what day you get the soybeans in the ground. And that transformation these last 5 or 6 years has been quite remarkable, I mean, to be honest with you. And it's been facilitated by the fact that people have made the movement with equipment, right? So many farms today now have 2 planters, one dedicated to corn, one dedicated to soybeans. That's been a big change. That's facilitated that. But that management change, and Dan, the recognition that you need to be thinking about optimal planting conditions for corn, that's not something we used to focus on quite so much. It was really tied much more to the planting date.
Get it out. Get
it in the ground. It's not perfect, but it's in the ground.
Weren't farmers kind of forced into this a few years back, and that's
disease of sudden death syndrome. That disease typically infects during early growth, and there's some really good seed treatments available that helps with that. So that's definitely come together in addition to the message of how these soybeans can respond to timely plantings, and then also pretty much. Well, in terms of heat unit accumulation, I did go ahead and look at this too. I did Dan's job. It's UTU on corn, but I use it for soybeans too. And where we're tracking on heat unit accumulation for the season, and then what they're projecting, we're falling right.
So the Purdue Commercial Ag Cast is available on all the major podcast providers. That's probably the easiest way to. One a few days ago, so that one's out there. And if you're interested in what's going on with respect to farmland values, cash rent values here in Indiana, that's a good podcast to listen to. But when you start disaggregating that and looking at some of the regional values, there were some areas that we saw some declines on both farmland values and on cash rent. So we are starting to see a change take place. It's not just same old, same old. So it was an interesting survey this year, and I'd encourage folks to maybe tap into that.
And I'll point out, Dan and Shaun, that Jim hosts this podcast. He didn't have to bring in a so-called professional like you two did to put a podcast together.
Well, you're the only one that makes this go, so we appreciate that. You definitely put lipstick on this pig.
Guys, as we wrap up this podcast, what else do we need to know about this corn crop? You sticking? You think it's over 190? You think 195 is too high? Give me your update here. Come on, give me the update, Dan.
Well, I'll have to go between 190 and 195. So let's
go
193 then. We'll go 193. But 193. I think the main story is there's still a lot of yield out there. I'd be really, really interested when the combines start to roll what those numbers look like. Disease is really the big topic to continue to watch. We always talk about tar spot, but southern rust was found in Kentucky, so it's kind of moving that way. So Darcy does track that. She has maps on southern rust. So the southern part of the state, they really kind of pay attention to that. Gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, kind of those forgotten about diseases. They have been starting to show their faces recently too. So, if you're still in that range, R1 to R3 growth stages, where that fungicide still can benefit you, it's still important to monitor that crop, watch that crop. But really across the state, Shaun and I we were down in Shelby County recently this week. I'm not sure I saw a bad cornfield. So just excellent looking crop. Talking to a lot of the farmers, we talked to some farmers yesterday, and they just said, "No, it looks great." I think we're heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot of time left, still a lot of yield left out there. So hopefully we can finish strong.
Still got to finish this thing off, right, Shaun?
That's right. Soybean side, I think I'm just cautious on. There's a little bit of disease popping here and there. Some white mold that management was long ago. You couldn't do anything till it now. It has popped a little bit, some Phytophthora. Overall, frog eye leaf spot, I haven't seen much going on there. So I think we're in a pretty good state overall in terms of the disease. I do wonder about these really dewy mornings we've had for the last 2 weeks. And so, that's where frog eye would probably start to show up now. So go on scout. Very rarely would we go ahead and make an application on these R5 soybeans, but there's still some pretty good yield potential out there.
Michael, Jim, I'll give you an opportunity here too.